What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
On a frozen corridor of Canada's far north, a story has traveled for nearly a century, passed from newspapers to pulp collections to late-night conversations where the dark feels a little closer. It's the tale of an Arctic camp discovered intact, undisturbed, and inexplicably empty. Some say the people fled. Others insist they were taken by something that moved through the night without leaving tracks. Investigators and skeptics have questioned the tale for decades, but the legend remains. A place where ordinary life ended mid-motion, and the silence that followed felt unnatural. Tonight we examine the vanishing village of Angikuni Lake, a cold spot in the world where legend and fact often collide, but the one constant is the fear that it imposes on those who listen. So get comfortable, put on a warm blanket. We're telling that story tonight. The tundra doesn't scream. It doesn't need to. It just waits, white and wide and patient, until you understand just how small you are. Angikuni Lake lies far north in Canada, strung along the Kazan River corridor, in what's now the Nunavut's-Kilvalik region. In winter, the lake becomes a lid of hard ice, the kind that creaks like a living thing when the wind presses down. The sky can feel too close, and the silence is so complete that a single boot step sounds almost like a confession. Now imagine walking toward a camp you've visited before. You expect smoke. You expect movement. You expect the quick, excited barking of sled dogs announcing a stranger's approach. Instead, nothing. A tent flap taps in the wind, open like a mouth that forgot how to speak. A cooking pot sits near a fire pit, cold now, but arranged as if someone meant to eat. Inside one tent, a mitten lies half-finished, the needle still threaded through the wool, like the maker simply stood up mid-stitch and never sat down again. Outside, dog teams are still tied to their lines, not sleeping, not resting, dead, starved, frozen in place. And then, as if the Arctic wants one last flourish, there's a grave, stones carefully arranged around it, undisturbed, the earth opened anyway, and the body is gone. That is the legend of Angikuni Lake, an Inuit camp that vanished so suddenly that supper was left to cool and sewing was left unfinished, an entire community erased in a single heartbeat of northern light. But what happened to them? And why? What is fact and what is fiction? If you're going to build an unforgettable disappearance, You set it somewhere people can't easily verify. Angikuni Lake is real, remote, rocky shoreline, caribou country, a river route landscape where lakes and crossings form natural corridors. It's the kind of place that, in 1930, felt like the far edge of the world to anyone reading a newspaper in the South. And in the legend, that distance is a character all of its own. It's the reason the story can be told with certainty and dread, but without the usual clutter of details, street names, neighbors, official timelines. The legend begins with a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle. In the classic telling, LaBelle isn't some clueless tourist. He's a working man who knows the cold. He knows how far a bad decision can carry you out there. And he knows this camp near Angikuni Lake. He's stopped there before, traded there before, warmed himself there before. The people know him. They've welcomed him. It's a reliable point of human life in a landscape that is otherwise all wind and distance. One day in late 1930, LaBelle heads toward the camp, looking for shelter. As he closes in, he realizes something's wrong before he can put a finger on it. No dogs bark, no voices, no movement. He calls out. Nothing answers. He steps into the camp. The first thing he notices is how normal everything looks. That's the hook. The tents are up. The supplies are there. Tools are stacked. A few small fires appear recently used. The camp in no way looks destroyed. It looks like it's on pause, like time stopped in the middle of a sentence. LaBelle checks the first tent. Empty. The next. Empty. In some retellings, there are 6 tents. In others, more. Either way, the effect is the same. The camp is built for people who aren't there. And then the details begin to twist the knife. There's sewing unfinished, clothing and garments mid-stitch, a needle left in place as if the person meant to come right back. There's food, meat described as left out or stew described as left on a fire. Some versions insist the fire was still warm, that smoke still curled, that the meal was still cooking. The image is almost too perfect. Domestic life interrupted at the most ordinary moment. Next comes the detail about weapons. In one version, rifles are lined up and untouched, left behind as if every hunter decided at once that they no longer needed food or defense. In another version, the weapons are missing, taken in haste. Either way, the story pushes you toward the same conclusion. Whatever happened here did not follow the rules. Then LaBelle steps outside and sees the dog lines. If you've never been around sled dogs, understand that they represent transportation, warmth, hauling power, survival. In the Arctic, dogs aren't an accessory. They're a lifeline. They are also loud, social creatures, hard to ignore and hard to silence. But in the legend, the dogs are silent because they're dead. 7 teams, still tethered, still harnessed, dead from starvation. This is the detail that makes listeners sit forward. People can leave supplies, people can flee without packing, but who leaves their dogs to die? Especially when they're the main source of transportation. The story presents it as proof of suddenness and terror. The villagers didn't just decide to move. They were forced, they were taken, or they fled so blindly that they forgot the most basic rule of survival in the Arctic. You do not abandon your dogs. LaBelle walks the perimeter, looking for tracks, footprints, sled marks, drag lines, anything. The story says he finds none, or none that matter, or none that lead anywhere. And then he finds the aforementioned grave. A circle of stones, an opening in the earth, the body missing, the stones undisturbed. The legend insists an animal couldn't have done this. The grave looks carefully opened by hands that knew what they were doing, and then carefully left behind, as if whatever stole the body didn't want to leave behind a mess. At this point, the camp has shifted from abandoned to just wrong. LaBelle panics. In the story as told, he runs hard, back the way he came toward the telegraph lines, toward an RCMP detachment, toward any form of authority that can make the world feel sane again. He reports what he saw: an Inuit camp at Angikuni Lake empty, dogs dead, sewing abandoned, a grave opened. The legend says the authorities respond immediately. Uniforms, dog teams, searchers moving across the ice, men scanning the white horizon for smoke or movement. And here, the story takes its most cinematic step. In some versions, the searchers see strange lights, but not the familiar aurora that ripples in high curtains, but low, pulsing glows, blue-green flashes, a silent presence, something in the sky that doesn't behave like weather. This is the moment the legend mutates into an abduction story. It is the place where the imagination leaps. The people didn't run away. They were collected. Sometimes the story adds a ship in the distance, dark, impossible, moving where no ship should move. Sometimes it adds a humming sound. Sometimes it adds the idea of a beam. It depends on the storyteller, because by now, we're fully in the land of folklore. But even if you strip all of that away, you're left with a scene that feels like horror. A camp that appears lived in. A life interrupted mid-stitch. Dog teams dead on their lines, a grave opened, its dead removed, and no human beings anywhere. And then comes the detail the legend always saves for last, the one that turns the whole scene from abandoned into impossible. Because LaBelle isn't just staring at empty tents, he's staring at a place where life stopped mid-breath. That's when he realizes the most frightening thing of all. Whatever happened here did not leave in a hurry. It left nothing behind. Let's keep 1 foot in the scary version and 1 foot in reality, because here is an uncomfortable truth. In the far north, movement can look mysterious if you don't understand the rhythm of the land and the life on it. Inuit families historically traveled seasonally, following caribou migrations, fishing cycles, weather, and social networks. Camps could be temporary, established just for a season, abandoned and revisited. To an outsider, a camp might appear permanent because the tents are familiar, because the fire pits are used, because supplies are stored. But a camp can also be between uses or recently vacated for reasons that make perfect sense from a local perspective. So, if we momentarily accept that LaBelle truly found an empty camp, the first question is simple. Was it really a village the way Southern newspapers imagined? Or was it a small camp along a travel corridor? In the earliest known telling, it's a small camp, 6 tents, about 25 people. That matters because 25 people can relocate quickly, especially if they have a reason. So, what reasons could exist that still allow for a genuinely unsettling scene? Weather would be the most obvious one. The Arctic can turn on you, and fast. Whiteouts, pressure cracks, sudden freeze-ups that make travel dangerous. If a group decided to move quickly to safer ground, maybe toward a known wintering spot or a more protected inlet, they could leave in haste. But the dog teams are the problem that is hard to solve. That detail is the anchor of the legend because it's the least compatible with normal relocation. Dogs are not left behind. So let's explore some grounded possibilities that still fit a scary vibe. Number 1, the dog teams were already compromised. If disease or poisoning affected the dogs, or if a storm or scarcity made feeding them impossible, the camp could face a brutal decision. A starving winter with sick dogs is a disaster. People could attempt to move without them, especially if they could travel by other means, on foot, by sled improvised, or by joining another group. Number 2, misinterpretation. A trapper sees dead dogs and assumes they were left to starve, but perhaps they died rapidly from exposure, illness, or a single catastrophic event. Perhaps the dogs were dead but not starved over time, the way the legend frames it. Number 3, the best friend and arch nemesis of legend, exaggeration. This is where folklore enters. A report might begin with, "The camp was empty," and "some dogs were dead," and quickly become, "all the dog teams were tied up and starved," because that's the detail that makes the story unforgettable. The same is true of the pot on the fire and the needle in the mitten imagery. That's a classic interruption tableau, like a movie set designed to signal sudden disappearance. It's the kind of detail storytellers love because it tells you, instantly, how to feel. Now, the grave. In the legend, it's opened and empty. That implies human action either by someone from the camp moving remains, or someone hostile committing desecration, or something supernatural taking the dead. But in real Arctic conditions, graves can be disturbed for many reasons. Animals, erosion, ice heave, freeze-thaw cycles, even relocation of remains for cultural or practical reasons, especially when the ground conditions make burial difficult. A grave with stones is not a vault, it's a marker in a harsh landscape. And again, the legend insists the stones were undisturbed, which is storytelling shorthand for this wasn't an animal. But storytelling shorthand is not field documentation. So, where does that leave us? If you want a natural explanation, the simplest is that the camp relocated, and the stranger who found it interpreted ordinary absence as extraordinary disappearance. If you want a darker, human explanation, you can imagine coercion or violence, but the legend rarely includes evidence of struggle, and real violence usually leaves evidence, which is why the legend turns to the sky. UFOs, lights, silent presences, because the supernatural explanation preserves the perfect cleanliness of the scene. It explains why there are no tracks. It explains why there are no bodies. It explains why the camp looks paused in time. But there is one more possibility, one that's less paranormal and more unsettling, albeit in a different way. What if the mystery is not what happened at Angikuni Lake, but what happened in the telling? Because when you start looking for records, the Angikuni story behaves like smoke, visible, dramatic, and impossible to hold. And that's where the fear shifts, not to a monster in the sky or a shadow in the snow, but to something colder. What if the vanishing village didn't vanish on the tundra? What if it vanished into print? Now, here's the pivot moment, and it is important to handle it carefully, because the landing shouldn't kill the fun, it should sharpen it. The earliest widely cited source for the Angikuni Lake story is a newspaper article published in late 1930 by a journalist named Emmett E. Kelleher. In the article, Kelleher describes Joe LaBelle's discovery of an empty Inuit camp near Angikuni Lake, 6 tents, around 25 missing people, and he sells it as a mystery, quote, stranger than fiction. That phrase matters because it tells you what the piece is trying to be, not a police report, not a field journal, not an official investigation summary. A mystery story. And here's what tends to happen with mystery stories that involve remote places and indigenous people in the early 20th century. They become a kind of northern theater. The details are chosen for mood. The distance is used as proof, and the people in the story, Inuit families with real lives, are turned into silhouettes. As the years pass, later writers pick up Kelleher's article and amplify it. In the 1950s, it appears in collections of true mysteries and strange but real tales. From there, it migrates into UFO literature, pulp paperbacks, and eventually, the internet, where it becomes a copy and paste legend. And with each migration, the story grows new limbs. 25 people becomes 30, then 300, then 1,000. One grave becomes every grave in the cemetery. A cold fire becomes still warm. A camp becomes a village. A winter sky becomes mysterious lights. A newspaper mystery becomes a documented case. This is how folklore works. It mutates towards the most emotionally satisfying version. But what about the RCMP investigation the story always references? This is where it gets interesting. Over the decades, RCMP correspondence and later summaries have expressed skepticism about the Angikuni tale. The broad idea is consistent. There is no solid foundation for the story as it's popularly told, and no official record that matches the scale of the legend's scope. In some accounts, an RCMP sergeant in the early 1930s questioned LaBelle's credentials and noted that the journalist was known for colorful writing, suggesting that the case may have been inflated or even invented for a headline. That doesn't automatically mean LaBelle didn't exist or that he didn't see an empty camp. It means something simpler, and in its own way, creepier. The story may have been born in print, because if you remove the later embellishments and focus on what can be traced, you're left with a single central narrative that arrives already polished, already cinematic, already containing the perfect props. The often cited sewing interrupted, food abandoned, dogs dead, and grave opened. Real-life events tend to be messier than that. If an entire community vanished, you'd expect other signals, missing person reports, trading post chatter, overlapping testimony, mention in regional records, follow-up reporting. But the Angikuni, despite being famous, doesn't come with that kind of supporting structure. It comes with one early article and a long tail of retellings. This is the moment to pause and ask, why exactly did this story stick? Because the Angikuni legend scratches a very specific itch. It gives us the missing village without forcing us to sit through the slow, complicated realities of northern life. It gives us the fear of absence. It gives us the horror of normal life interrupted. It gives us a clean puzzle with no messy human conflict, because the villain is either the sky or the unknown. In other words, it is the perfect scary story. But that also means the story can accidentally do harm if we're careless. It can encourage listeners to think Inuit communities are mysterious or vanishing in ways they aren't. It can turn real people into set dressing. That's why this approach is so important. We let the legend run. Then we show the seams and we treat Inuit life as real and grounded, not as supernatural fodder. Because the real North is already intense. It doesn't need aliens to be strange, powerful, and mysterious. And the real reason the Angikuni story is so unsettling might not be because a village vanished. It might be because a story was able to take on the weight of truth simply by being repeated. So if you're still picturing that mitten with the needle left inside it, hold on to that image, because the scariest question in Angikuni isn't, where did they go? It's simply this: how many of the details you're afraid of were written simply to make you afraid in the first place? So here's the cleanest way to hold Angikuni Lake in your mind without breaking it. 1. The Angikuni Lake exists, and Inuit families have lived, traveled, and hunted throughout the Kazan River region for generations. Camps in the north can be seasonal, responsive, and mobile, movement that feels mysterious only if you don't understand the pattern. 2. The vanishing-village story, as commonly told, is best treated as folklore. The earliest widely cited telling comes from that 1930 newspaper article that framed it as an extraordinary mystery. Later retellings amplified it, sometimes dramatically, adding bigger numbers, stranger details, and of course, the UFO elements. 3. Over time, skeptical researchers and law enforcement summaries have questioned the story's foundation and noted a lack of records matching the legend's scope. That doesn't prove every element is false, but it does mean we can't responsibly claim the legend as a verified historical event. And yet, here's the fun part. The legend still works, because the fear at the center of the Angikuni doesn't require it to be literally true. It requires it to be emotionally true. Humans are terrified by interruption, by the half-finished mitten, by the pot left behind, by the moment when life was happening, and then wasn't. The Angikuni story is a cousin to other great absence myths: lost colonies, empty ships, abandoned towns, because it gives us a clean horror with no definitive explanation. It invites the listener to stand on the edge of that camp and feel the unnatural stillness. And if you've ever been somewhere remote, truly remote, where human presence is rare, you know how quickly your mind reaches for meaning. In the north, the sky is big, the ground is old, and the wind will happily erase every sign of your passage. The environment itself can make ordinary events feel paranormal. On one level, Angikuni is a lesson in storytelling, how a single vivid article can become a myth. On another level, it's a lesson in perspective, how mystery often grows in the gap between outsiders and a landscape they don't understand. And on the most basic level, it's still a great scare. Because even if the village didn't vanish the way the legend claims, the image remains. A camp in the snow, a flap tapping in the wind, a needle left in the cloth, dogs silent on their lines, and the feeling, pure and simple, that you arrived a moment too late to see what happened. For better or worse. That's why Angikuni survives. It's not because it's proven. It's because it's cold. It's lonely. It's the kind of story that makes you glance at the dark window beside you and imagine, just for a second, what it would feel like to step outside and find your world paused, as if something came through while you weren't looking. And if you hear something tonight, a creak, a crack, a distant sound, you'll remember Angikuni Lake and how the tundra is always hiding something. And the next time you're alone, truly alone, and the world goes quiet in that special way, you'll understand why this legend never really disappeared. It just adapted. What makes the Angikuni such a perfect example of how legends form? The gap between people who live in a place and the people who can only imagine it. The Kazan River region isn't a blank. It's a corridor. Caribou move through it in great migrations. Families know the crossings, the timing, the wind, the safe shorelines. A camp can be here one week and there the next, for reasons as practical as food and weather, and as social as joining relatives for the season. To an outsider arriving late, especially an outsider who expects a fixed village, that movement can feel like a vanishing act. Now, in regards to Joe LaBelle, beyond the legend, he becomes hard to pin down. In some tellings, he's a well-known trapper with years of experience. In others, later skepticism suggests he may have been newer to the territory than the story implied. That uncertainty doesn't just muddy the tale, it explains how easily a single vivid report can become a foundation for decades of so-called facts that are really just echoes. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. You can write a mystery on paper, and if it's good enough, the world will help you keep it alive. People will repeat it because it feels real. They'll add details because the details make it better. They'll treat the repetition as evidence. That's not paranormal phenomenon. That is human nature. Still, let's not pretend the legend doesn't have teeth. Even if Angikuni was only a story, it's a story set in a place where real danger is constant. People can die quickly in that environment. People can be lost. A small camp can be emptied by tragedy and leave behind a scene that looks, to the next traveler, like the world stopped in mid-motion. So, if you prefer the chilling version, keep it. Picture the camp as LaBelle found it. Needle in the mitten, pot near the fire, dogs silent on their lines. Picture the wind erasing tracks as quickly as they're made. Picture the sky alive with cold light. And then, when you turn out the lights tonight, remember this. The Arctic doesn't care whether a story is true in the way a courtroom needs it to be. It only cares whether you survive. And somewhere out there, real lake or imagined shoreline, a tent flap is still lapping in the wind, not calling for help, not warning you away, just making that soft, patient sound that says, whatever happened, it could happen again. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com. And produced by Dan Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.